So here's the problem with most buck fever advice. It'll teach you how to deal with buck fever, not help you harvest the buck. Most advice on buck fever focuses on breathing exercises, and it is what I would call generally passive tools, because it's focused on buck fever, not on the reason you're out in the field in the first place. So let's say you apply one of these tools, you have buck fever, you start the breathing exercise, and you remove the buck fever. Then what? And perhaps even worse, you're working on getting your buck fever under control. But what is under control? When are you calm enough to continue? If your hunt turns into one long breathing exercise, that buck will end up leaving. In this video, I'm going to give you a tool that helps you manage buck fever, but also put you back in the driver's seat, so you can harvest wild meat and put trophies on your wall. Let me first share one of my old buck fever stories, or buffalo fever stories. Picture this. We're in the Central African Republic, deep in the bush, and we've been driving down narrow dirt tracks, or really paths to the bush, all day, and we've suddenly spotted a group of buffalo. I waited a long time for this trip, saved a lot of money, so I felt the pressure adding. To top that off, I had some challenges with our luggage. For whatever reason, my main checked-in suitcase never arrived, which meant I had no clothing other than my essential hunting kit that I traveled in and carried in my carry-on, but I also didn't have any ammunition for my rifle, so I had to borrow the PH rifle. Another thing I had to process when hunting. When spotting these bulls, we got off the vehicle and started stalking them carefully. And it didn't take us that long before we were within range. The PH set up the tripod and I got the rifle ready and put the crosshairs on the mature bull that he'd pointed out. I pulled the trigger slowly and a loud bang indicated that the .458 lot had gone off. It was a good shot. It's a fairly big target, but I connected as I should. However, that bull wasn't really convinced, not even by 500 grains of copper. So the bulls take off and run further into the bush. And it's at that moment that I'm hit by a freight train of buck fever. Not sure why it didn't happen in the first shot, but after the shot, it certainly really got going. So suddenly adrenaline is pumping and my hands are starting to shake a little bit as we stalk these bulls through the bush for a follow-up shot. It's not really the ideal condition to be in if you've got to be swift and nimble for a follow-up shot on a charging buffalo. Anyway, that's what I had to deal with. We stalk a bit further into the bush, and fortunately they've paused further up ahead. Again, sticks come up. I get the rifle and the sticks, and this time my hands are shaking and I really got to make an effort to get things under control. I managed to take another shot, but it takes great effort. Again, the bulls run further into the bush, and again we stalk carefully to get within range. As we move slowly through the bush, we hear this deep bellowing sound that indicates the buffalo is probably hit hard. And a bit further up ahead, we can see the buffalo that I've shot lying on the ground, with the back facing us. The PH and the team are extremely careful. Trackers throw a few rocks on the buffalo, and the PH asked me to give it one last shot down through the back from where we're standing. Everyone is keen for an insurance policy before we approach it. At this point, my buffalo fever is peaking, and I'm almost trembling, and I really have to steady myself to get my hands under control as I take the shot. It's close, I'm standing, it's not hard, but I'm really struggling. I take the shot, the PH shakes my hands, gives me a hug, and all I can manage to say is a holy moly with tears running down my cheeks from that adrenaline-fueled emotional experience after having waited so long, prepared so much for that moment. I'm not saying shooting the buffalo was pure luck, but it definitely was lacking proper tools to get me focused and to not just deal with my buck fever, but to work through my buck fever to shoot the buffalo. As I said earlier, most buck fever advice is not adequate to help you harvest the buck. That's not to say it's not good advice, and I will surely share a couple of tools that I recommend you using that I use myself, but let's go and look at what in my mind is the essential tool for not just managing buck fever, but for hunting through buck fever. Back in 1972, a guy called Lanny Bassam won gold at the Olympics in 50-meter rifle shooting. And Lanny Bassam is, in my mind, the guy who wrote the book on mental management. And he wrote the book on mental management based on gold medal winning experience, not on theory. And he has a couple of points that, although he didn't design them or come up with them in relation to buck fever, they apply directly to buck fever management and the issue I said or talked about earlier with traditional buck fever advice. So let me share two of the concepts that Lanny Bassam prioritized. So one of the key concepts that Lanny Bassam talks about is process focus versus outcome focus. Outcome focus is focusing on the price. So in this case, it would be focusing on how you have a beautiful trophy on the wall, focusing on telling the stories of a successful hunt to hunting buddies. That's positive outcome focus. You can also talk about negative outcome focus, which is hyping yourself up or giving yourself, creating more tension in yourself because you think about, okay, what if I have to come home back and explain this empty truck bed? What story do I need to tell if I'm coming home empty-handed? Outcome focus is focusing on things you don't directly control. Process focus, on the other hand, is focusing on the individual steps and actions that you take to move to your outcome. And that is why the first concept that we can take out of Lanny Bassam's book is that you need to focus on the process because it puts you in control. So that's almost more on the general hunting side of the equation than it is on the buck fever equation, but it's kind of two sides of the same coin. So let's talk about the other concept from Lanny Bassam that you need to consider when you want to manage or work through buck fever. In Lanny Bassam's toolbox, he talks about three concepts: the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and the mental program. And the mental program is a process. So in general, at a very high level, the idea is that your subconscious mind is how you execute the key activities, like pulling the trigger. The conscious mind is what you think about when you're hunting. And the conscious mind can only focus on one thing at a time. And for buck fever management, that means that if you keep your conscious mind busy with a productive task, you'll have less time to work yourself up into buck fever, or you can work yourself out of buck fever. The subconscious mind is where your skills live. So I guess you can call the conscious mind your working memory and the subconscious mind your long-term memory. So your subconscious mind is how you execute skills, you execute the majority of the shot. It's what Barbara Oakley would call subroutines. And the mental program is Lanny Bassam's concept for controlling your conscious mind. Controlling it so the subconscious mind can do its work. It's the process in process focus versus outcome focus. So for buck fever, it means that you need to give your conscious mind a step-by-step program for the shot so you can focus on things you control, so you don't think about all the good things or bad things that could happen that can end up working you up and creating buck fever. So we could stop the video here and I could say all you need is a mental program. You need an X-step process to help you execute the shot. And you need to practice it so much that parts of it become unconscious. You're on an autopilot. You run through the major steps in your conscious mind, and your subconscious mind execute things like trigger pull. And by having that process, you can work through avoid buck fever. But if you don't have a process, here's one that I use that you can use yourself or adopt and tweak to your own preferences. If we zoom all the way out, I use an overall framework to plan any hunt or season. I call it FABLE, and it stands for Fundamentals, Application, Planning, Logistics, and Execution. The fundamentals part of FABLE, it's a hunting process, which starts with find, reach, set up, shoot, and follow up. And shoot is a separate process for executing the shot. And that's what I recommend that you use as a mental model or the mental program to help you avoid buck fever. That process I refer to as Raptor Strafer, and it has 9 steps. But to keep it simple, let's focus on, or let's break those, or let's combine those 9 steps in 4 overall phases. So the first phase is that you get ready for the shot. Make sure your sights are dialed in and you have a cartridge in the chamber. In my experience, you really need a checklist to make sure your rifle is ready, because it's easy to forget to check when a lot of stuff is going on around you. And phase 2 is build your position. And it's all the steps that you take to make sure that you have a solid foundation for executing the shot. In my Raptor Strafer framework, I split building the position into 3 overall steps. One is build the position. It's literally making sure you hold the rifle correctly. 2 is remove or balance tension, which is all about having correct recoil management, not just for precision, also for calling the shot and for following up. And the last step of build is remove slack. It means making sure you have a solid position to get the correct or achieve the correct amount of precision. The third phase covers everything that you do to execute the shot. I use 3 distinct steps. First off is safety off and finger on the trigger. Then it's breathe and aim. And finally, it's pull the trigger to fire. And the fourth phase of executing the shot is follow up. And I split that into 2 steps. Follow through the recoil, which is required for proper consistency and precision, and call the shot and reload, because you need to assess what happened and you need to be ready to take action if that's required. So let's just recap on how those steps apply to buck fever management. Phases 1 to 2, conscious mind engagement, is where you establish position, you go through the motions required to set up for a proper shot. Phase 3 is kind of a transition phase. Safety off, finger on the trigger, and breathe are conscious steps. And as you're aiming, you're getting or waiting for green light based on the position presentation of the animal. Your trigger pull will become subconscious. And phase 4, the follow-up, recoil and reload, then you're back in the conscious space, allowing the rifle to settle, calling the shot, reloading so you're ready for the next step, whatever that means. So as you can see, having a process to occupy your conscious mind means that all those nasty thoughts that create buck fever won't sneak in. And if you do get buck fever, having something to focus on will help you manage the buck fever, reduce the buck fever, or work through the buck fever. And the idea with the process is that you are in control. For sure, it can help with other tools as supplement, and I certainly use them. So let's talk a little bit about what we can call supporting techniques. So first of all, I'd say there's breath exercises. There's different ways of breathing that'll help you calm your nervous system. And I recommend you consider box breathing, pursed lips exhale, and then the cherry on top, the psychological sigh. Things like meditation or non-sleep deep rest can also be a good thing to practice as ways of helping you to focus, as ways of helping you to close your mind and push thoughts away, as ways to help you manage or control the busy mind, which is more the psychological side. On the physical side, you should prepare your cardiovascular system to make sure you can easily handle a higher pulse and that your body is used to bringing that pulse down quickly. And then finally, practicing these things, I recommend that you use timed shots or time yourself on the range, because timing introduces a little bit of, let's call it stress, slightly higher or elevated pulse. And it's definitely a benefit to get used to working through that sort of condition. There's a ton of other benefits from timed shootings in terms of improving your marksmanship skills that you'll get from that type of exercise as well. So as I said earlier, buck fever management is not the end goal in its own right. That is one other thing I want you to consider in relation to buck fever management, which I'll get back to. Before we get there, have a think about the concept of process focus versus outcome focus. Have a think about how buck fever management is not the result in its own right. And have a think about how you can apply a process to work through buck fever. Check out my article, blog post on buck fever management. There's a ton of resources, and I'm also linking to a couple of other blog posts on traffic lights for shooting, when you have green light, when you have red light, which is related to working through buck fever. When we talk about working through buck fever, isn't the end station. Harvesting the animal is the end station. I really recommend that you watch this video to get a solid understanding of where you need to aim. Not just in general on a broadside shot, that's the easy one, although there are some pitfalls, but where you need to aim for different types of presentation, angles, etc., because that is one of the keys to working through buck fever. If you are focusing on your process for shooting, the aim part of the Raptor Strafer process will be you assessing when the animal stands or presents itself in the correct way that you can then pull the trigger. And that presentation will become your anchor point for the shot. It'll become the remedy for buck fever.